In the middle of a millionaire's party, in front of investors from around the world, a 13-year-old boy was ridiculed by the richest man in the room. The millionaire laughed out loud, certain he was just dealing with the maid's son. But seconds later, the boy did something so surprising that silence fell over the party, leaving everyone, including the millionaire himself, speechless. In the heart of Manhattan, Alexander Whitmore's penthouse shone like a beacon above the river. The glass hall reflected the city, while crystal chandeliers spilled gold onto marble tables. Waiters crossed the floor in precise trajectories, silver trays vibrating with French champagne. Impeccable fabrics, expensive perfumes, and calibrated laughter created the illusion of a perfect night. Alexander, 49, circulated as a general among allies, certain that nothing escaped his command. Every flower, every soundtrack, every light had been rehearsed to sign a historic international agreement. The script called for easy applause, bold promises, and signatures that would multiply his power. Behind the smiles, however, loomed the anxious expectation of investors alert to any failure. The host knew this game and fed it with calculated phrases and gestures of calm superiority. Everything about him exuded dominance: the tailored suit, the rare watch, the look that needed no explanation. In the kitchen, timers marked invisible deadlines so that nothing would deviate from the narrative of greatness. In the service corridor, hurried footsteps erased crumbs of the unexpected before they became rumors. It was the night that would crown years of ambition, and Alexander enjoyed the feeling of destiny in his control. There was, however, a subtle vibration in the air, a low noise that pride did not notice. History, silently, was preparing a detour as subtle as it was irreversible. Marion Brooks, 34, walked along the edge of the room with the dexterity of someone who had learned to be invisible. He held towels and crystals as if he were carrying confidences, taking care of the shine that bears no signature. He knew his boss's temperament, the words that hurt without raising his voice, the rules that changed according to the audience. That night, the main rule was simple: no slip-ups, no off-script appearances. Backstage, 13-year-old Ethan Brooks waited silently for his mother to finish her shift. He had the curious eyes of someone who takes the world apart to understand it and puts it back together better than he found it. From the gaps in the curtains, I observed cables, screens, patterns of light that no one noticed among the gifts. To Alexander, a boy like that was an irrelevant statistic, a detail outside the map of influence. For Marion, it was the entire future balanced on a thread, requiring caution and courage in equal measure. With each order that crossed the room, she measured distances, anticipated shocks, cushioned humiliations. Work called for silence, love, vigilance, necessity, discreet resistance. The orchestra filled the air with polished strings, and every note seemed to say that everything was under control. Marion's inner silence, however, said otherwise, and weighed like fine china about to crack. The boy breathed softly, attentive to signals that passed freely between adults busy with themselves. Somewhere between the chandeliers and the wings, a thread of tension began to stretch. Alexander raised his glass in a rehearsed toast and received smiles that reflected ambition and calculation. He announced projections, listed markets, and promised returns that would make history in the economics pages. The guests nodded with the cadence of someone who first applauds and then signs a contract. The host felt the tide in his favor and pushed the speech into the realm of inevitability. From the bottom, a foreign investor asked for specific numbers, and the air lost a degree of complacency. Executives lined up to respond, but stumbled over details that didn't add up. Alexander smirked, determined to push the doubt aside with charm and authority. The following applause sounded a little hollow, like cracked crystal that still shines but no longer sings. Marion noticed the crack in the night's music and pressed the cloth between her fingers, trying to smooth out the invisible. Ethan noticed patterns on the backing panel and memorized flickers of light that seemed to beg for attention. The city continued to shine beyond the glass, indifferent to small private earthquakes. The host believed he had closed the matter, and the party resumed its luxurious choreography. The fissure, however, did not close. It simply learned to wait for the right moment to reveal itself. When the right question finds an answer that no one foresees, the room will know another silence. And the control, so displayed, will discover how fragile it is when someone invisible decides to speak. Alexander Whitmore strode through the room as if he owned not only the penthouse, but also the horizon stretching beyond the glass walls. His gaze wasn't that of a host, it was that of a conqueror. He measured each guest not by their presence, but by the weight of the check they might sign. His calculated smile glided between greetings, and his deep, controlled voice cut through the air with phrases that sounded like decrees. To investors, he was the epitome of American self-confidence. To employees, the symbol of constant vigilance. No mistake escaped that gray gaze, which had reduced proud men to awkward silences. Marion Brooks, discreet in her blue uniform, knew this better than anyone. Her every step was measured, her every gesture trained to avoid provoking her boss's impatient temper. Still, even surrounded by the crowd in formal wear, she carried the weight of being remembered by Alexander not as a person, but as a disposable detail in the machinery that sustained the party's brilliance. As conversations flowed in French, English, and German, Alexander seized a pause to reinforce his favorite order, repeated to all the household staff like an immutable law. Her boy must not appear here. He said the sentence without looking at Marion, but loud enough for those closest to him to hear and smile in complicity at the cruel tone. There was no need to mention Ethan by name. To Alexander, the 13-year-old was merely an annoying shadow, someone who shouldn't exist in the same space as his distinguished guests. Marion swallowed, maintaining her composure, but the flush on her face betrayed the wound those words always reopened. The boss's arrogance wasn't just about displaying power. It was about crushing any spark of dignity that dared to shine outside his golden circle. In the distance, Ethan, hidden behind a half-open door, heard the sentence and clenched his fists tightly, unable to understand why his mere presence was treated as an insult. What Alexander didn't know was that, by enforcing his prohibition, he was creating the exact opposite of what he wanted. He was drawing the boy into the center of the story. Ethan wasn't the type to accept imposed boundaries without question. His natural curiosity expanded like water seeping through cracks. As the guests raised glasses and smiled at the flashing cameras, the boy watched silently, learning from each gesture, absorbing patterns that adults considered invisible. Marion, across the room, felt the fear in her chest that, sooner or later, the silence would be broken. Alexander, overconfident, didn't realize that the evening wasn't about contracts or figures. He was about to discover that the detail he so despised had the power to turn the page on his own story. And when that happened, no amount of speech or arrogance would be able to rebuild the lost silence. Ethan Brooks knew how to move around the mansion like someone learning to breathe unnoticed. By the age of 13, he had become an expert at occupying forgotten corners, silent hallways, and cracks between doors where adults' gazes never lingered. He wore clothes too simple to contrast with the surrounding luxury. A white shirt already worn at the sleeves and dark pants that were a little too short. He wasn't just a boy looking for a hiding place. He was a keen observer, whose eyes registered details no one else seemed able to see. As the guests clinked glasses of champagne and discussed distant markets, Ethan mapped every movement of the waiters, every flicker in the lights on the electronic board, every impatient gesture Alexander made as he spoke to the investors. He knew he shouldn't be there, that his place was far from the party, but there was something inside him that compelled him to watch, as if sensing that this evening would not be indifferent to him. Outside the half-open door, he saw Marion gliding through the room, her eyes downcast and her hands busy, but her heart aching as she tried to protect her son from an unfair rule. Ethan understood his mother's struggle, but he couldn't accept that his existence was being treated as a mistake. Every word Alexander forbade his presence echoed in his mind like a challenge. The millionaire said the maid's boy had nothing to offer, and that sentence stung more than any humiliation. But even as he carried this pain, Ethan cultivated a secret flame within himself, the desire to prove he could see beyond what others saw, that his curiosity and intelligence were worth more than the scorn he received. The laughter in the room rang loudly, but to him it was just a smokescreen hiding cracks. And cracks always intrigued him, because through them the truth escapes. As he watched, he noticed the meeting in the center of the room taking on a more serious tone. A foreign investor with a thick accent asked a direct question, demanding technical explanations about crucial figures for the deal. The previously light atmosphere seemed to hold its breath. Ethan leaned in to listen better, attentive to the tense faces of the executives as they tried to improvise a convincing answer. But each word sounded hesitant, each justification lost in confusing sentences. Alexander smiled with false calm, but impatience revealed itself in the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the crystal glass. The boy realized that, for the first time that night, there was an empty space in the narrative of power, a silence no one dared fill. And it was in this silence that Ethan felt something blossom within him, the certainty that perhaps he was the one holding the answer everyone was seeking. The mood in the room had changed. What had once been a spectacle of luxury and calculated applause was now marked by tense glances and discreet whispers. The foreign investor repeated his question in a firmer tone, demanding data to support Alexander Whitmore's billion-dollar promise. The executives looked at each other, searching through their briefcases and tablets for an answer that wouldn't come. The screens displayed confusing graphs, numbers that didn't add up, projections that seemed more like fragile assumptions. The silence grew heavy and awkward, even for guests accustomed to rehearsed speeches. Alexander maintained his smile, but his eyes flashed with irritation, revealing the fury of someone who couldn't tolerate having his authority questioned. He cleared his throat, feigning nonchalance, but he knew that a single mistake could jeopardize the contract he had been courting for months. Marion Brooks, who was discreetly circulating collecting glasses, felt the weight of the atmosphere. She knew that look on her boss's face, the same one that preceded silent outbursts, punishments that never came in shouts, but in cold humiliations. He pressed his fingers against the tray, trying to focus on his work and ignore the anxiety gnawing at his chest. But he couldn't keep his eyes from searching for Ethan. The boy stood motionless behind the door, his eyes fixed on the central table, observing every gesture with an attention that seemed beyond his years. He didn't just see nervous faces. He noticed the broken logic of the numbers, the flaws in the executive's reasoning, the details everyone else seemed to overlook. It was as if the failure had become a riddle only he could decipher. Marion felt a chill run down her skin, fearing what would happen if her son dared break the silence imposed by Alexander. The impatient host decided to cut the tension with irony. He raised his glass and, before the attentive gazes, blurted out mockingly, "It seems not even the best brains can answer such a simple question. Perhaps we should call someone from the cleaning crew to enlighten us." The laughter echoed through the room, complicit and cruel, reinforcing Marion's humiliation. Her blood boiled, but she kept her face down to avoid further scorn. However, Alexander failed to realize that his joke, intended to distract the guests, had opened an invisible breach. In the silence that followed, a soft but firm voice emerged from the background, cutting through the laughter like a blade. "I know the answer, sir." The room froze in shock. Ethan had revealed himself, and every eye turned to him in disbelief. as if an invisible detail had suddenly become the center of everything. The luxurious ballroom fell into a stunned silence, as if time had held its breath. Ethan Brooks's words echoed through the vast space, piercing through glittering chandeliers and marble tables, until they landed on the incredulous ears of the guests. "I know the answer, sir," the boy repeated, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Alexander Whitmore turned slowly, his smile frozen with audacity he had deemed unthinkable. His gray eyes bored into the boy like blades, and the tension turned to muffled laughter. First, a short laugh escaped Alexander, soon joined by a few executives who, eager to please their host, followed suit. The laughter spread through the room like a cruel, mocking wave, suffocating any possibility of taking the boy seriously. Marion felt her legs tremble, her face flushed with embarrassment, and she nearly dropped the tray of glasses she was holding. Her heart screamed to run to Ethan, to drag him away before the humiliation became irreversible. But there was something in her son's eyes that paralyzed her. It was a different look, intense, filled with a quiet confidence she had never seen before. While the guests laughed, Ethan remained motionless, his posture erect, his gaze fixed firmly on Alexander. He didn't blush, didn't look away, didn't tremble. He didn't look like a boy about to be crushed by collective mockery, but someone carrying a certainty impossible to ignore. Marion realized that the situation, desperate as it was, had slipped out of her control. Ethan had already chosen to speak, and nothing would make him back down. Alexander, relishing the attention the situation was giving him, raised his voice to intensify the humiliation. "Look, gentlemen," he said, laughing louder. "Now even the sons of employees think they can teach the world's greatest investors." The laughter echoed, and some foreign guests, not fully understanding the joke, laughed simply to follow their host. The laughter, however, hid a growing discomfort. There was something in Ethan's firmness that didn't fit the mocking narrative. The boy didn't seem about to retreat, but rather to advance. The contrast between the luxury of the room and the simplicity of his figure, between the debauchery of the rich and the serenity of an invisible boy, created an almost unbearable suspense. And in that moment, even without having yet spoken more than one sentence, Ethan had already transformed the atmosphere. Everyone waited, between laughter and disbelief, to see how far that boy's courage would go. Ethan Brooks took a deep breath, ignoring the echo of laughter still reverberating through the gilded hall. His eyes, steady and calm, stared directly at Alexander Whitmore, as if the weight of the millionaire's arrogance weren't enough to break him. The atmosphere, previously filled with laughter, now seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Everyone waited for the moment when the boy would stumble over his own words and confirm the joke they had just created. But when he opened his mouth, the room fell silent. His voice was firm, clear, and each word rang with unexpected assurance. Ethan didn't speak like a shy child trying to impress. He spoke like someone who had spent nights observing, absorbing, and deciphering patterns no one else noticed. It was as if every detail accumulated in silence had finally found the perfect moment to reveal itself. He walked to the central table, approaching the projection board displaying confusing graphs. With confident gestures, he pointed to lines and numbers, explaining simply the error the executives had made, a misinterpreted piece of data that distorted the entire calculation. "The basis used is incorrect," he said calmly. "If you apply this index to the contract, the result will be a loss, not a gain. It's like building a bridge starting from the wrong point. No matter how sturdy the structure, it will never meet in the middle." The comparisons were direct, almost didactic, but charged with a clarity that made the investors look at each other in astonishment. Gradually, laughter gave way to attentive looks. The boy, ignored minutes before, spoke with the lucidity of someone who had seen what all the adults had missed. And the more he spoke, the more natural it seemed that he would be heard. "Marion Brooks, in the background, had tears in her eyes. Each word her son spoke was like a blow to the humiliations she had so often swallowed in silence. Alexander, for his part, tried to mask his unease with a sarcastic smile, but his nervousness showed in the movement of his fingers drumming against the crystal table. This boy, whom he so despised, was disarming in minutes the embarrassment that threatened to ruin his major contract. The contrast was unbearable. The millionaire surrounded by helpless advisors and, before them, a boy in plain clothes revealing the truth as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The room, now completely silent, awaited Ethan's next move, and the question hanging in the air was no longer whether he would say something wrong, but how far his explanation would go. It was like watching the impossible happen before one's eyes. The investors, once complicit in Alexander's mocking laughter, now leaned forward in their chairs, like students before an unlikely teacher. The room, once vibrant with superficial conversation, was suspended in absolute silence, broken only by Ethan Brooks's firm voice. A German executive, who had asked the initial question, raised his eyebrows in surprise, taking note of every detail the boy explained. It was as if, in a matter of seconds, the credibility of Alexander's entire team had shifted to this plainly dressed boy. The contrast was shocking. Men with international diplomas remained silent, while a 13-year-old boy conducted the logic of his reasoning with crystal clarity. And the more he spoke, the harder it was to ignore the precision of his words. Each sentence seemed to dismantle an invisible wall erected by the pride of adults. Marion Brooks watched from afar, her heart torn between fear and pride. She knew that with every sentence, Ethan risked being crushed by Alexander's wrath, but she also knew there was something bigger going on. The boy wasn't just correcting numbers. He was challenging an entire power structure that had always disregarded his existence. And there was beauty in that, a beauty so rare it brought discreet tears to her eyes, hidden behind a tablecloth. The guests, accustomed to measuring value solely by fortune and surname, were witnessing something no amount of money could buy, spontaneous genius blossoming where least expected. It was impossible not to feel the impact of that scene, as if every glance acknowledged that an invisible threshold had been crossed. And for Marion, every second seemed to immortalize the truth she had always known. Her son was extraordinary. Alexander, however, was not about to surrender the spotlight so easily. He forced a laugh and approached the table, crossing his arms in front of the boy. "Interesting," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Very impressive for someone who, until yesterday, should have been learning to tie his own shoes." He tried to regain control of the situation, but his tone betrayed impatience. The investors, however, were no longer smiling at him. In their eyes shone something Alexander wasn't used to seeing: doubt. And this doubt was a silent threat, more dangerous than any previous question. For the first time that night, the millionaire felt the stage was no longer his, and that the boy's next move could crumble the entire power play. Inside him, an uneasy feeling began to grow. What if he were faced with a talent impossible to silence? The silence that hung over the room seemed to vibrate, as if everyone there awaited the outcome of an invisible duel. Alexander Whitmore still maintained his arrogant smile, but his eyes betrayed the fury of someone watching control slip through his fingers. The investors, accustomed to technical speeches and rehearsed presentations, were faced with something unprecedented: a skinny boy in simple clothes, fearlessly challenging the narrative constructed by an empire. Ethan Brooks didn't back down. His slender fingers moved naturally across the projection board, highlighting numbers and rearranging data that the adults had deemed irrelevant. "The error isn't in the final calculation," he explained, "but in the starting point. If you correct the baseline, you'll see that the predictions change completely." His voice echoed with certainty and a strange authority, as if he had been born for this moment. It was impossible to ignore him, and the more he spoke, the clearer it became that it wasn't luck or chance, but pure perception. Some executives glanced at each other, frowning as they mentally confirmed the boy's logic. A Japanese investor, known for his rigidity, leaned toward his colleague and murmured something gravely, acknowledging the coherence of his reasoning. The translator could barely keep up. So fast was Ethan pointing out flaws and redesigning possibilities. To the guests, accustomed to seeing young people his age engrossed in games or social media, the scene seemed surreal. A Maid's son correcting experts trained at the world's top universities. Some chuckled softly, not in mockery, but in disbelief. Others kept their eyes fixed on him, as if witnessing the impossible. And all the while, Marion watched with her heart racing, her trembling fingers clutching the cloth to her chest, as if each word her son spoke were a conquest snatched from the hands of fate. Alexander, realizing he was losing his edge, decided to resort to humiliation as a last resort. He stepped forward and, in a voice thick with sarcasm, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "And what's next, boy? You want my place at the negotiating table too?" The phrase drew a few nervous chuckles, but no one dared laugh as hard as before. The mood had shifted. The boy was no longer a joke, but a presence impossible to ignore. Ethan, undaunted, lifted his chin and calmly replied, "I don't want your place, sir. I just want to show the truth that's right in front of everyone, but that no one wanted to see." The words, simple and direct, echoed like an invisible punch to Alexander's chest. The entire room felt the tension explode into electricity. The battle was no longer just about numbers or contracts. It was about pride versus humility, about power versus truth. And in that moment, for the first time, it was unclear who would emerge victorious. All eyes now turned less to Alexander Whitmore and more to the boy who dared to challenge him in the very heart of his empire. Ethan Brooks remained serene, as if every word he uttered merely confirmed something obvious. The executive's silence gave way to whispers in different languages, and translators struggled to keep up with the flood of information that intersected amid the growing tension. A French investor timidly raised his hand and asked Ethan if he could repeat the corrected projection he had presented seconds before. The boy took a deep breath, touched the charts again, and clearly demonstrated the stark difference between the correct and the distorted reading. The Frenchman's expression changed from skepticism to astonishment, and that was enough for others around him to lean forward on their tables, confirming for themselves that the boy's logic was irrefutable. For the first time, the power of Alexander's words wavered in the face of witnesses unwilling to be manipulated. From a distance, Marion felt her heart pound so hard it seemed to burst from her chest. For years, she had swallowed every humiliation in silence, every bitter word her boss had hurled at her and her son, telling him that a boy like Ethan would never amount to anything. Now, before an audience of international tycoons and investors, that same boy was listened to with an attention not even doctors or professors could achieve. The maid couldn't hold back the tears that quietly ran down her face. They weren't tears of shame, but of silent victory. Everything the millionaire had said was nothing but empty arrogance crumbled before the intelligence of a boy he himself had tried to erase. Every detail of the scene seemed to be etched in Marion's heart. The odd whispers, the attentive glances, and the unconcealable pride that made her breath quicken. Alexander, for his part, felt cornered. His smile no longer came naturally, and his hands, once steady, now drummed nervously against the crystal table. He realized that if he lost the trust of those investors, years of reputation and prestige would be swallowed up in minutes of embarrassment. He tried to intervene, forcing his voice into an authoritative tone. "Don't be fooled by childish tricks. We're talking about businesses that generate billions, not school games." But his words fell heavily in the room, echoing without echo. No laughter, no applause, no looks of support. Instead, What he saw was a series of half-closed, suspicious, watchful eyes. The mocking tone, once a surefire weapon, now sounded like desperation. Alexander realized that the room, which had always belonged to him, was already beginning to shift toward Ethan, and the mere thought of losing that control was unbearable. The room, illuminated by the glitter of crystal chandeliers, was unrecognizable. Where once there had been only Alexander Whitmore's imposing voice, now a new center of gravity emerged: Ethan Brooks. The investors, men and women accustomed to dealing only with million-dollar figures and coldly calculated reports, leaned in to hear the boy's every word. It was as if the truth they were all seeking had suddenly revealed itself, not by the hands of renowned experts, but through the simplicity of a boy who should never have been there. A Swiss investor, known for his rigidity in negotiations, politely asked Ethan to re-explain his initial point. The boy, without hesitation, patiently repeated the demonstration, using comparisons so clear that anyone in the room could understand. The effect was immediate. Whispers of approval began to spread among the guests. Marion Brooks watched the scene with a mixture of amazement and pride. She had never imagined seeing her son commanding the attention of a room full of the world's elite, much less after so many years of being treated as invisible. She remembered the times Ethan would spend hours studying on his own, delving into used books and old notes, always eager to understand beyond the surface. Now, all that secret dedication blossomed before an audience that would never have believed in the capabilities of a poor boy, the son of a maid. Her hands trembled as she held the tray, not out of fear, but from the thrill of seeing justice finally unfold before her eyes. Ethan's every word sounded like a silent scream against all the humiliations they had both endured inside that mansion. Alexander, for his part, felt the walls closing in around him. The authority he had always commanded seemed to slip like sand through his fingers. He tried to intervene again, but his voice no longer carried the same force. "We're getting sidetracked," he said, trying to regain their attention. But the investors didn't even move. They were too busy listening to Ethan. One of the foreign guests turned to Alexander and, in a respectful tone, asked, "Let the boy finish." It was like a stab to his vanity. For the first time, Alexander was forced to retreat from his own party. Ethan, faced with dozens of gazes that had previously scorned him, was now the center of attention. And most impressively, there was no fear in his eyes. Only the calm of someone who knew they held in their hands something more powerful than any fortune: the truth. Alexander Whitmore, accustomed to dominating meetings and silencing any dissenting voice with a simple expression of contempt, now witnessed the improbable, his authority slipping away before everyone's eyes. The room, once the scene of his supremacy, now seemed to belong to Ethan Brooks, a boy of just 13 who spoke with more conviction than any executive present. The investors, mostly foreign, no longer hid their changed attitude. Some nodded as Ethan concluded his remarks. Others asked for additional details, as if he were the meeting's official expert. With each word, the boy not only proved himself right, but also dismantled Alexander's mask of invincibility. It was a silent spectacle of power being transferred, not by force, but by lucidity. Marion, in the background, could barely hold back her tears. Her son's every gesture was a victory against years of humiliation, swallowed in silence. She remembered all the times Alexander had ridiculed her in front of other employees, repeating that she shouldn't know much due to lack of education. Now, ironically, it was her son who stood up as the only one capable of saving the night, which was slipping from his boss's grasp. Marion's heart swelled with pride, but also with fear. She knew Alexander's fury could be merciless once the party was over. Still, there was no denying the gift. Ethan was shining before everyone, and nothing seemed capable of extinguishing that light. For her, It was as if every second were a reparation for all the pain endured in silence. Alexander tried one last trick, standing up and slamming his hands on the crystal table, the sound echoing throughout the room. "Gentlemen, don't be impressed. He's just a boy. He has no education, no title, nothing." His voice was loud but fragile, almost desperate. What should have sounded like authority came across as insecurity. One of the investors, a gray-haired man in an impeccable suit, calmly stood up and said, "Sometimes, Mr. Whitmore, it's not the title that matters, but the truth you see. And so far, it's this boy who's shown us that." The impact was devastating. Alexander felt the blow as if he'd lost his breath. The sentence echoed like a verdict, and for the first time in a long time, the millionaire realized that no amount of laughter or sarcasm could save him. The atmosphere, which at the beginning of the evening had been carefully crafted to extol Alexander Whitmore's greatness, had now become the stage for his most bitter defeat. Eyes that had previously bowed in respect to the tycoon were now fixed on Ethan Brooks, awaiting his every word as if they were indispensable revelations. The young man, with the calm of someone with nothing to lose, continued his explanation. He detailed how the numbers had been misinterpreted and showed, step by step, how a simple correction could not only prevent losses, but also maximize the contract's gain. The clarity of his speech was such that even guests less accustomed to business jargon understood the logic. It was as if, for the first time, someone had opened the curtains of a dark room, allowing everyone to see what had always been before them. Marion watched, her trembling hands clutching the cloth tightly to her chest. Seeing her son before that audience of tycoons, firmly explaining something that even the seasoned executives hadn't grasped, seemed like an impossible dream. But it wasn't a dream, it was reality. The same reality she had believed for so many years was too cruel for them both. Now, before the eyes of the world, the truth was being rewritten. Ethan wasn't just the maid's son, as Alexander liked to sarcastically repeat. He was living proof that intelligence and courage recognized no barriers imposed by surnames or fortunes. Marion felt tears flow silently, but they were tears of victory, of a mother finally seeing her son occupy the space that had been denied him so many times. Alexander, for his part, seemed smaller by the second. Sitting with his jaw clenched and his gaze somber, he could no longer hide his discomfort. The party, which was supposed to be his celebration, had become a silent tribunal, with each guest acting as a judge, attentive to the host's embarrassment. A Spanish investor, who had remained silent until then, stood up and said in a clear voice, "I'd like the young man to finish. He has something we need to hear." The request drew murmurs of agreement throughout the room, and Alexander, for the first time in decades, found himself forced to give up space in his own home. It was a blow to his ego greater than any financial loss. As Ethan resumed his explanation, the millionaire realized with bitterness that, in front of this audience, he was no longer the one driving the narrative. When Ethan Brooks concluded his explanation, absolute silence fell over the room. It was no longer the silence of doubt or tension, but that of someone faced with something irrefutable. The graphs, numbers, and comparisons were all there, clear, indisputable. The boy had transformed a confusing equation into a crystal-clear truth, revealing in a few minutes what an entire team of executives had failed to see. The investors, previously dispersed between glasses of champagne and occasional conversation, were now motionless, fixed on the boy. The contrast was stark. The plainly dressed teenager, the son of a maid, had done more for that negotiation than all the pomp and ceremony prepared by Alexander Whitmore. It was an impossible moment to ignore, one that etched a watershed moment in everyone's memory. Marion Brooks felt her heart race with each passing second. Her gaze fixed on her son was filled with pure emotion. Ethan had not only survived the public humiliation Alexander had orchestrated, but had turned the tables in unimaginable ways. With every sentence he uttered, Marion remembered the times her son had devoted himself to his studies alone, without resources, with books borrowed or found in the trash, but with an insatiable curiosity. Now, before the world's elite, all that silent effort blossomed into a resounding triumph. She discreetly wiped away a tear, trying to maintain her composure in front of the other employees, but inside, her heart screamed with pride. It was as if, in a single instant, all the wounds opened by the humiliations had begun to heal. And then the unexpected happened. The first applause came from one of the most influential investors, followed by another, and within seconds the entire room erupted in applause that echoed among the crystal chandeliers. The sound was deafening, not just in its volume, but in its meaning. The guests weren't applauding a millionaire or a contract. They were applauding a boy who dared to speak the truth. Alexander, motionless in his chair, felt the ground give way beneath his feet. He had never experienced anything so devastating, being ignored at his own party, in his own home, in front of everyone he was supposed to impress. Each clap was like a verdict that reduced his arrogant figure to nothing. And amidst that applause, Ethan stood firm, not with the look of someone seeking glory, but of someone who knew he had earned respect. The thunder of applause echoed through the hall like an unstoppable avalanche. Alexander Whitmore, accustomed to being the center of attention, now found himself relegated to the role of an extra at his own party. With every clap, every smile directed at Ethan Brooks, his ego was battered like never before. The millionaire clenched his fists on the crystal table, trying to control the rage building within him. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he stood abruptly, the sound of his chair scraping against the marble floor momentarily drowning out the applause. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice thick with fury. But instead of silencing the room as it had on other occasions, his outburst was met with cold stares and even a hint of discomfort. The tone of desperation in his voice betrayed that he was no longer the master of the scene, but someone fighting against the tide. Ethan remained standing, motionless, watching Alexander like someone observing a storm that no longer frightens them. The boy didn't respond immediately. He let the silence speak for itself, and that silence was more devastating than any words. The investors, contrary to what Alexander expected, didn't turn their attention to him, but to Ethan, waiting to see if the boy had anything to say. It was a simple gesture, but one that made it clear where true authority lay at that moment. The tycoon, realizing this, felt a chill run down his spine. It was proof that, in the eyes of everyone, his power was fragmenting. The boy he despised was no longer just an annoying presence, but a real threat to his image of perfection. Marion Brooks, still holding the tray, watched with her heart racing. For a moment, she feared Alexander's fury would fall upon his son in a cruel and public way. But seeing Ethan maintain his composure, she felt courage reborn within her. He knew this battle was no longer just about contracts or numbers. It was a contest of truths, the millionaire's arrogance versus the humility of a boy who dared to believe in himself. The applause slowly faded, but the message had already been delivered. Alexander was alone, surrounded by an audience that no longer believed in his infallibility. And he, even without admitting it, realized that any rash word could forever destroy the image he was trying to protect. The mood in the room had changed irreversibly. What had once been a carefully planned spectacle to extol Alexander Whitmore had now become a silent tribunal, where every investor's gaze seemed to judge his conduct. He tried to regain his composure, straightening his suit and forcing a smile that resembled a cracked mask. "Gentlemen, of course everyone is impressed by the audacity of this boy," he said, extending his hand toward Ethan Brooks. "But let's not mistake a moment of luck for real experience." His voice sounded more like a plea than an affirmation. The room, however, didn't respond with its usual nod of approval. The silence that followed was heavy as lead, making it clear that his words no longer had the same effect. One of the most respected investors, a silver-haired man named Mr. Reinhardt, calmly stood up, adjusted his glasses, and stared Alexander down. "With all due respect, Mr. Whitmore," he said gravely, "what we just saw wasn't luck. It was clarity, precision, and intelligence. And frankly, it's something we haven't heard from you tonight." The murmur that rippled through the room sounded like a collective verdict. Alexander, for the first time, didn't know what to say. His hands were sweating, his hardened face trying to hide his embarrassment, but his authority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Ethan, still motionless, remained serene, as if he understood that strength came not from the loudest voice, but from the truth that resisted any attack. Marion Brooks, watching the scene, felt a wave of relief mixed with overwhelming pride. The millionaire who had so often belittled her, who had mocked her son and his silent efforts, was now exposed in the middle of a party as an ordinary man, vulnerable and flawed. It was proof that arrogance, no matter how seemingly unshakable, always finds its moment when it crumbles. And there, before the entire international elite, Alexander was alone, cornered, and with no way out. The weight of Reinhardt's words not only silenced him, but also permanently transferred the investor's trust to Ethan. The boy no longer needed to prove anything. He had already achieved the impossible. Alexander, on the other hand, faced a humiliation he never imagined he would face, and the certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The room that had begun the evening as a showcase for Alexander Whitmore's power now belonged to another name, one no one had ever uttered before that night: Ethan Brooks. The applause returned, not as explosive as before, but denser, more respectful, as if each clap were a true acknowledgement. Ethan, still standing before the projection screen, slowly lowered his hands and looked at the faces around him. There was no arrogance in his expression, only serenity. "I just wanted to show what was in front of everyone," he said humbly, "because sometimes the truth needs courage to be seen." The impact of his words plunged the room into silence again, but this time a silence of reverence. He wasn't just the maid's son. He was the boy who had turned a night of arrogance into an unforgettable lesson. Marion Brooks, still in the corner of the room, could no longer hide her tears. Each drop that ran down her face was laden with years of pain that were now beginning to dissolve. She remembered the humiliations, the cruel words Alexander had hurled at her and her son, as if they were condemned to live forever invisible. But in that moment, before the eyes of the world, Ethan stood as living proof that greatness is not measured by money or titles, but by the courage to be true. A mother's pride filled every part of her being, and she knew she would never forget that moment. Her son had done the impossible. Not only had he silenced the millionaire, but he had earned respect where before there had been only contempt. Alexander, for his part, was defeated. His party, his mansion, his empire, none of it was enough to stop a boy from taking away what he valued most: control. Sitting with a blank stare, he realized that every round of applause directed at Ethan was a brick knocked off his pedestal. And the audience, made up of the biggest names in international business, would never forget what they saw that night. Arrogance had been exposed, and the truth had won. Ethan walked to his mother, and Marion hugged him tightly, as the guests still watched. And as the scene ended, the message was clear: nothing could stop the power of truth. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. And, of course, leave a like, because that really helps the channel continue bringing you moving stories like this. Thank you so much for your support.